Hello everybody, I'm Miss Jessica from 𝘏𝘏𝘭𝘦𝘴 and we are going to be continuing our chapter book story time today. We are reading Holes by Louis Sachar and we have just left off where Zero ran away and they decided that they were just going to pretend he never existed, and Stanley was so worried about him that he tried to steal the water truck and go after Zero. Unfortunately, he crashed the water truck into one of the many holes that is there. And so luckily he just kept walking and came across Zero, who was hiding, or I guess not hiding, hanging out underneath Sam's old boat that had some of Kate Barlow's spiced peaches still in there. And that's what they've been drinking to stay alive, and they call it sploosh. Now, Kissin' Kate Barlow was around a long time ago. I don't know if I would want to try those peaches. That's just me, but at least I guess it's something when you're really, really thirsty and hungry. All right, so we're going to pick up there, and Harper's here to join us. So we're going to start with chapter 36. They put 4 of the unbroken jars in the burlap sack in case they might be able to use them. Stanley carried the sack. Zero held the shovel. I should warn you, Stanley said, I'm not exactly the luckiest guy in the world. Zero wasn't worried. When you spend your whole life living in a hole, he said, the only way you can go is up. They gave each other the thumbs up sign, then headed out. It was the hottest part of the day. Stanley's empty canteen was still strapped around his neck. He thought back to the water truck and wished he'd at least stopped and filled his canteen before running off. They hadn't gone very far before Zero had another attack. He clutched his stomach as he let himself fall to the ground. Oh, hi, Wrigley. Stanley could only wait for it to pass. The sploosh had saved Zero's life, but now it was destroying him from the inside. He wondered how long it would be before he too felt the effects. He looked at Big Thumb. It didn't seem any closer than when they first started out. Zero took a deep breath and managed to sit up. Can you walk? Stanley asked him. Just give me a second. Zero said. He took another breath, then using the shovel, pulled himself back up to his feet. He gave Stanley the thumbs up, and they continued. Sometimes Stanley would try to go for a long while without looking at Big Thumb. He'd make a mental snapshot of how it looked, then wait maybe 10 minutes before looking up at it again to see if it seemed closer. It never did. It was like chasing the moon. And if they ever reached it, he realized, then they'd still have to climb it. I wonder who she was, said Zero. Who? Mary Lou, said Zero. Stanley smiled. I guess she was once a real person on a real lake. It's hard to imagine. I bet she was pretty, said Zero. Somebody must have loved her a lot to name a boat after her. Yeah, said Stanley. I bet she looked great in a bathing suit sitting in the boat while her boyfriend rowed. Zero used the shovel as a third leg. 2 legs weren't enough to keep him up. I've got to stop and rest, he said after a while. Stanley took a look at Big Thumb. It still didn't look any closer. We know that Mary Lou was a donkey. I don't think she looked good in a bathing suit. He was afraid if Zero stopped, he might never get started again. We're almost there, he said. He wondered which was closer, Camp Green Lake or Big Thumb. I really have to sit down. Just see if you can go a little. Zero collapsed. The shovel stayed up a fraction of a second longer, perfectly balanced on the tip of the blade. Then it fell next to him. Zero knelt, bent over with his head on the ground. Stanley could hear a very low moaning sound coming from him. He looked at the shovel and couldn't help but think that he might need to dig a grave. Zero's last hole. And who will dig a grave for me, he thought. But Zero did get up, once again flashing thumbs up. Give me some words, he said weakly. It took Stanley a few seconds to realize what he meant. Then he smiled and said, Are you in? Zero sounded it out to himself. Run. Good. F-U-N. Fun. The spelling seemed to help 𝘏. It gave him something to concentrate on besides his pain and weakness. It distracted Stanley as well. The next time he looked up at Big Thumb, it really did seem closer. They quit spelling words when it hurt too much to talk. Stanley's throat was dry. He was weak and exhausted, yet as bad as he felt, he knew that 𝘏 felt 10 times worse. As long as 𝘏 could keep going, he could keep going. It was possible, he thought, he hoped that he didn't get any of the bad bacteria. 𝘏 hadn't been able to unscrew the lid. Maybe the bad germs couldn't get in either. Maybe the bacteria was only in the jars, which were opened easily, the ones he was now carrying in the sack. What scared Stanley the most about dying wasn't his actual death. He figured he could handle the pain. It wouldn't be much worse than what he felt now. In fact, maybe at the moment of his death, he would feel too weak to feel pain. Death would be a relief. What worried him the most was his parents. What worried him the most was the thought of his parents not knowing what happened to him, not knowing whether he was dead or alive. He hated to imagine what it would be like for his mother and father day after day, month after month, not knowing, living on false hope. For him, at least, it would be over. For his parents, the pain would never end. He wondered if the warden would send out a search party to look for him. It didn't seem likely. She didn't send anyone to look for 𝘏. But no one cared about 𝘏. They simply destroyed his files. But Stanley had a family. She couldn't pretend he was never there. He wondered what she would tell them and when. Sorry, 2 cats playing over there, making noise. What do you think's up there? 𝘏 asked. Stanley looked to the top of Big Thumb. Oh, probably an Italian restaurant, he said. 𝘏 managed to laugh. I think I'll get pepperoni pizza and a large root beer, said Stanley. I want an ice cream sundae, said 𝘏, with nuts and whipped cream and bananas and hot fudge. The sun was almost directly in front of them. The thumb pointed up toward it. They came to the end of the lake. Huge white stone cliffs rose up before them. Unlike the eastern shore where Camp Green Lake was situated, the western shore did not slope down gradually. It was as if they had been walking across the flat bottom of a giant frying pan, and now they had to somehow climb up out of it. They could no longer see Big Thumb. The cliffs blocked their view. The cliffs also blocked the sun. 𝘏 groaned and clutched his stomach. But he remained standing. I'm all right, he whispered. Stanley saw a rut about 1 foot wide and 6 inches deep running down a cliff. On either side of the rut were a series of ledges. Let's try there, he said. It looked to be about a 50-foot climb straight up. Stanley still managed to hold the sack of jars in his left hand as he slowly moved up from ledge to ledge, crisscrossing the rut. At times he had to use the side of the rut for support in order to make it to the next ledge. 𝘏 stayed with him, somehow. His frail body trembled terribly as he climbed the stone wall. Some of the ledges were wide enough to sit on. Others stuck out no more than a few inches, just enough for a quick step. Stanley stopped about 2/3 of the way up on a fairly wide ledge. 𝘏 came up alongside him. You okay? Stanley asked. 𝘏 gave the thumbs up sign. Stanley did the same. He looked above him. He wasn't sure how he'd get to the next ledge. It was 3 or 4 feet above his head, and he didn't see any footholds. He was afraid to look down. Give me a boost, said 𝘏. Then I'll pull you up with the shovel. You won't be able to pull me up, said Stanley. Yes, I will, said 𝘏. Stanley cupped his hands together, and 𝘏 stepped on his interwoven fingers. He was able to lift 𝘏 high enough to help him grab the protruding slab of rock. Stanley continued to help him from below as 𝘏 pulled himself onto the ledge. While 𝘏 was getting himself situated up there, Stanley attached the sack to the shovel by poking a hole through the burlap. He held it up to 𝘏. 𝘏 first grabbed hold of the sack, then the shovel. He set the shovel so that half the blade was supported by the rock slab. The wooden shaft hung down towards Stanley. Okay, he said. Stanley doubted this would work. It was one thing for him to lift 𝘏. It was half his weight. It was quite another for 𝘏 to pull him up. Stanley grabbed hold of the shovel as he climbed up the rock wall, using the sides of the rut to help support him. His hands moved one over the other up the shaft of the shovel. He felt Zero's hands clasp his wrist. He let go of the shaft with one hand and grabbed the top of the ledge. He gathered his strength and for a brief second seemed to defy gravity as he took a quick step up the wall and, with Zero's help, pulled himself the rest of the way over the ledge. He caught his breath. There was no way he could have done that a few months ago. He noticed a large spot of blood on his wrist. It took him a moment to realize it was Zero's blood. Zero had deep gashes in both of his hands. He held onto the metal blade of the shovel, keeping it in place as Stanley climbed. Zero brought his hands to his mouth and sucked on the blood. One of the glass jars had broken in the sack. They decided to save the pieces. They might need it to make a knife or something. They rested briefly, then continued on up. It was a fairly easy climb the rest of the way. When they reached the flat ground, Stanley looked up to see the sun, a fiery ball dancing on top of Big Thumb. God was twirling a basketball. Soon they were walking in the long, thin shadow of the thumb. Chapter 37. We're almost there, said Stanley. He could see the base of the mountain. Now that they were really almost there, it scared him. Big Thumb was his only hope. If there was no water, no refuge, then they'd have nothing, not even hope. There was no exact place where the flat land stopped and the mountain began. The ground got steeper and steeper, and there was no doubt that they were heading up the mountain. Stanley could no longer see Big Thumb. The slope of the mountain was in the way. It became too steep to go straight up. Instead, they zigzagged back and forth, increasing their altitude by small increments every time they changed directions. Patches of weeds dotted the mountainside. They walked from one patch to another using the weeds as footholds. As they got higher, the weeds got thicker. Many had thorns, and they had to be careful walking through them. Stanley would have liked to stop and rest, but he was afraid they'd never get started again. As long as Zero could keep going, he could keep going too. Besides, he knew they didn't have much daylight left. As the sky darkened, bugs began appearing above the weed patches. A swarm of gnats hovered around them, attracted by their sweat. Neither Stanley nor Zero had the strength to try to swat at them. How are you doing? Stanley asked. Zero pointed thumbs up. Then he said, if a gnat lands on me, it will knock me over. Stanley gave him some more words. B-U-G-S, he spelled. Zero concentrated hard, then said, Boogs? Stanley laughed. A wide smile spread across Zero's sick and weary face as well. Bugs, he said. Good, said Stanley. Remember, it's a short U if there's no E at the end. Okay, here's a hard one. How about L-U-N-C-H? Suddenly, Zero made a horrific wrenching noise as he doubled over and grabbed his stomach. His frail body shook so violently, and he threw up, emptying his stomach of the sploosh. He leaned on his knees and took several deep breaths. Then he straightened up and continued going. The swarm of gnats stayed behind, preferring the contents of Zero's stomach to the sweat on the boys' faces. Stanley didn't give him any more words, thinking that he needed to save his strength. But about 10 or 15 minutes later, Zero said, lunch. As they climbed higher, the patches of weeds grew thicker, and they had to be careful not to get their feet tangled in thorny vines. Stanley suddenly realized something. There hadn't been any weeds on the lake. Weeds and bugs, he said. There's got to be water around somewhere. We must be getting close. A wide clown-like smile spread across Zero's face. He flashed the thumbs up sign and fell. He didn't get up. Stanley bent over him. Come on, Zero, he urged. We're getting close. Come on. Hector, weeds and bugs, weeds and boogs. Stanley shook him. I've already ordered your hot fudge sundae, he said. They're making it now. Zero said nothing. Chapter 38. Stanley took hold of Zero's forearms and pulled him upright. Then he stooped down and let Zero fall over his right shoulder. He stood up, lifting Zero's worn-out body off the ground. He left the shovel and the sack of jars behind as he continued up the mountain. Zero's legs dangled in front of him. Stanley couldn't see his feet, which made it difficult to walk through the tangled patches of weeds and vines. He concentrated one step at a time, carefully raising and setting down each foot. He thought only about each step and not the impossible task that lay before him. Higher and higher he climbed. His strength came from somewhere deep inside himself and also seemed to come from outside as well. After focusing on Big Thumb for so long, it was as if the rock had absorbed his energy and now acted like kind of a giant magnet, pulling him toward it. After a while, he became aware of a foul odor. At first, he thought it came from 𝘏, but it seemed to be in the air, hanging heavy all around him. He also noticed that the ground wasn't steep anymore. As the ground flattened, a huge stone precipice rose up ahead of him, just barely visible in the moonlight. It seemed to grow bigger with each step he took. It no longer resembled a thumb. Around him, the smell became stronger. It was a bitter smell of despair. Even if he could somehow climb Big Thumb, he knew he wouldn't find water. How could there be water at the top of a giant rock? The weeds and bugs survived only by occasional rainstorm, like the one he had seen from camp. Still, he continued toward it as if nothing else, he wanted to at least reach the thumb. He never made it. His feet slipped out from under him. 𝘏's head knocked against the back of his shoulder as he fell and tumbled into a small, muddy gully. As he lay face down in the mud ditch, he didn't know if he'd ever get up again. He didn't even know if he'd try. Had he come all this way just to... You need water to make mud. He crawled along the gully in the direction that seemed the muddiest. The ground became gloppier. The mud splashed up as he slapped the ground. Using both hands, he dug a hole in the soggy soil. It was too dark to see, but he thought he could feel a tiny pool of water in the bottom of his hole. He stuck his head in the hole and licked the dirt. He dug deeper, and as he did so, more water seemed to fill the hole. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it. First with his fingers, then with his tongue, he dug until he had a hole that was about as deep as his arm was long. There was enough water for him to scoop out with his hands and drop on 𝘏's face. 𝘏's eyes remained closed, but his tongue poked out between his lips, searching out the droplets. Stanley dragged 𝘏 closer to the hole. He dug and then scooped out some more water and let it pour out of his hands into 𝘏's mouth. As he continued to widen his hole, his hand came across a smooth, round object. It was too smooth and too round to be a rock. He wiped the dirt off of it and realized it was an onion. He bit into it without peeling it. The hot, bitter juice burst into his mouth. He could feel it all the way up to his eyes. And when he swallowed, he felt its warmth move down his throat and into his stomach. He only ate half. He gave the other half to 𝘏. Here, eat this. What is it? 𝘏 whispered. A hot fudge sundae. All right, we're going to stop there for today. So we just finished chapter 38 and we're going to start chapter 39 next time. And we are getting pretty close to the end. It's hard to tell, but we don't have too much more left in our book. So I can't wait to see what's going to happen. So I'm so glad that they were able to at least find a little bit of water, even if it's kind of muddy water, and maybe even something to eat with the onions. And if you think about it, this might tie to some things that we read about in our story earlier. So thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed our chapters. I'm getting very excited to see what's going to happen next. Are they going to make it back to camp? Are they even going to try to make it back to camp? And is anyone going to come looking for them? And how does this all tie to Kiss and Kate Barlow? I still have a lot of questions, so I'm very excited to keep going. So we will do that next time. And don't forget to go to our YouTube page, EVPL Library, and you can like and subscribe and then see when we upload new content. And if you go to evpl.org, our website, you can see our schedule that we have and then also get links to some of our amazing content. We have activities, we have book discussions, we have our chapter book story time. And then also, if you go to our Facebook page and follow us there, you can also be notified of when we add new things. So thank you for joining me. I hope to see you again soon. Bye.